The snowstorm on Blackwood Pass had transformed the evening into a blinding wall of white chaos. Daniel kept both hands clamped tightly on the steering wheel of his battered, 15-year-old pickup truck. The heater was blasting a weak, rattling stream of lukewarm air, barely keeping the windshield from freezing over completely. On the passenger seat sat a small, hand-drawn picture of a smiling son signed in messy crayon by his 6-year-old daughter, Lily. That drawing was the only thing keeping his focus anchored. He had promised the babysitter he would be home by 8, but the mountain road had become a treacherous trap. As the truck crawled around a dangerous, unlit bend, Daniel's headlights caught the sleek, metallic glint of a luxury vehicle. A massive, high-end black SUV was pitched sideways, its front tires completely buried in a deep snowbank just inches from a steep drop into the ravine below. The hazards were blinking feebly against the dark. Daniel felt a heavy knot tighten in his chest. Every instinct told him to keep driving. He was a single father with no safety net, living paycheck to paycheck since the local manufacturing facility had abruptly shuttered its doors. Getting stranded out here meant risking everything. But as he drew closer, he saw a frantic movement behind the tinted glass of the SUV. Someone was trapped inside, desperately trying to push the driver's door open against the accumulating weight of the snowdrift. Daniel swore under his breath, pulled his truck to the shoulder, and stepped out into the freezing gale. The wind hit him like a physical blow, slicing through his faded canvas jacket. He walked with heavy, deliberate steps toward the stranded vehicle, his boots sinking deep into the fresh powder. He tapped firmly on the glass of the driver's side window. After a tense moment, the glass rolled down just a few inches. Inside sat a woman wrapped in an incredibly expensive cashmere coat, her hands gripping the leather steering wheel so hard her knuckles were completely white. Her sharp, striking features were tight, with a mixture of terror and fierce pride. Even in the middle of a literal blizzard, she carried an unmistakable aura of absolute authority. "Do you mind?" she snapped, her voice cutting through the whistling wind like a blade. "I have this situation completely under control. The emergency services have already been notified." Daniel looked down at the spinning, useless tires of her heavy vehicle, then back at her defensive expression. He kept his voice steady, grounded, and entirely unbothered by her sharp tongue. "Yeah," he said calmly. "Looks like you've got it fully managed, except the emergency services aren't coming. The state police closed the lower gates 10 minutes after I passed them. No tow trucks are climbing this ridge tonight." The woman's eyes narrowed, a flash of genuine panic flickering across her face before she quickly masked it with cold arrogance. She was used to commanding boardrooms, not negotiating with strangers on a freezing mountain. "I am perfectly capable of waiting in my vehicle. It has heated seats and a full tank of gas. Your exhaust pipe is already halfway buried in that drift," Daniel replied, his tone remaining level and factual. "If you stay in here with the engine running, carbon monoxide will fill the cabin before midnight. The storm is only worsening. There is an old forestry service cabin about half a mile up this trail. We need to move now." She hesitated, looking out at the endless abyss of white darkness. The wind roared, violently shaking the heavy SUV. Realizing she had no cards left to play, she finally pushed the door open, brushing past him with an icy glare. "Fine," she muttered. "But if this turns out to be a mistake, you will regret it." "It's not a mistake," Daniel said quietly, stepping ahead of her to break the wind. As they fought their way through the blinding snow, Daniel couldn't shake the heavy irony settling in his stomach. The bright, flickering light of his flashlight caught the side of her designer leather bag, revealing a small, engraved gold emblem, Carter Dynamics. Daniel didn't need to ask for her name. He knew exactly who she was. Elena Carter. The brilliant, ruthless billionaire CEO who had signed the executive order to close the Silver Creek manufacturing plant just 3 weeks ago. She was the woman whose signature had instantly stripped 300 local families of their livelihoods, including his own. To her, he had been nothing more than a line item on a quarterly deficit spreadsheet. To him, she was the reason he had spent the last 20 days skipping meals so Lily could have fresh fruit. They reached the weathered wooden door of the abandoned cabin. Daniel threw his shoulder against the frozen wood, forcing it open. They stumbled inside, slamming the door against the howling fury of the blizzard. The interior was pitch black, freezing, and completely still. Daniel pulled an old emergency lantern from his backpack, flicking it on. The harsh amber glow filled the small room, illuminating Elena's pale, shivering form. She stood in the center of the cabin, arms crossed tightly over her chest, trying desperately to maintain her intimidating composure despite her trembling chin. She looked up, meeting his gaze. She noticed the sudden, intense stillness in his eyes. Her executive instincts immediately flared. "What?" she asked defensively, her voice echoing in the quiet cabin. "Why are you looking at me like that?" Daniel slowly set the lantern down on a dusty wooden table. The silence between them grew heavy, suffocating. "Nothing," he said quietly. "People don't say nothing like that unless it's something," Elena countered, her eyes narrowing as she tried to read the unbothered, masculine calm of the man standing before her. "If you have something to say it." Daniel took off his wet gloves, looking at the calluses on his palms. When he looked back up, his eyes were completely steady. "You're Elena Carter, CEO of Carter Dynamics." Elena straightened her posture, instinctively falling back on her corporate armor. "Yes, I am. And I assume you have an opinion on that?" "I used to work at the Silver Creek plant," Daniel said simply, his voice devoid of anger, carrying only a profound, exhausted weight. "The one your office shut down last month." The words hung in the freezing air like ice. Elena froze, her breath catching in her throat as the reality of her situation suddenly became terrifyingly clear. The silence in the cabin stretched so thin it felt as though it might shatter. Elena's eyes locked onto Daniel, her mind racing through emergency corporate protocols that were utterly useless here. She had faced down hostile activist investors and aggressive board members, but standing in front of a man she had casually displaced with a stroke of a pen, a man who currently held her survival in his hands, was a completely different kind of threat. She braced herself for the anger. She expected him to demand answers, to vent his frustration, or to leverage her vulnerability. Instead, Daniel simply turned his back to her, knelt by the hearth, and began inspecting the old brick fireplace. "The chimney flue is rusted open," Daniel said, his voice entirely flat. "That's good. It means we won't suffocate, but it also means the draft is going to pull the heat out fast." Elena blinked, thrown off balance by his complete lack of hostility. "You're not going to say anything else?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly from the encroaching chill. "You're not angry?" Daniel didn't look up. He cleared away a layer of dead leaves from the grate with his bare hand. "Being angry won't keep us warm, Miss Carter. Right now, the temperature is dropping, and the wind is coming from the north. We have about 20 minutes before the ambient air in here matches the outside." He stood up, his tall, imposing frame moving with an efficient, unhurried grace. He walked to the corner of the cabin where a few split logs were stacked beneath a rotting canvas tarp. He inspected them, tossing aside the ones ruined by moisture until he found 3 that were relatively dry. Elena watched him, her polished exterior beginning to crack under the sheer weight of her helplessness. She pulled her expensive coat tighter around herself, but the designer fabric was built for walking from a luxury limousine to a heated skyscraper, not for enduring a sub-zero blizzard. Her fingers were already losing their sensation. She pulled out her phone, staring at the screen. No service. "Don't waste the battery," Daniel advised, striking a match from a small, waterproof casing he kept in his pocket. He carefully nurtured the tiny flame against a handful of dry birch bark he'd pulled from his jacket. The cold drains lithium batteries twice as fast. "If the storm clears by noon tomorrow, you'll need that phone to coordinate your team." "I don't need a lecture on electronics," Elena muttered, though she immediately slid the phone back into her pocket. She approached the hearth, drawn to the fragile orange glow of the newborn fire. She watched his hands rough, lined with scars from years of heavy labor, yet incredibly steady as he placed the kindling. "How long did you work there?" 4 years, Daniel replied. He blew softly onto the embers, his breath forming thick white plumes that mingled with the smoke. "I was a senior mechanic on the main assembly line. I kept the automated heavy presses calibrated." The Silver Creek facility was operating at a 12% loss, Elena said, her voice instinctively retreating into the cold comfort of metrics and data. The decision wasn't personal. It was a structural necessity to save the parent company from a broader collapse. Daniel finally turned his head to look at her. The amber firelight caught the sharp angles of his face, highlighting a gaze that was profoundly discerning. 12%, he murmured. "To you, that's a number on a slide deck. To the town, that 12% was the mortgage on the grocery store, the funding for the clinic, and the reason families could afford heating oil. My daughter's school had to cut its after-school program last week because the local tax base vanished overnight." Elena shifted uncomfortably, the heat from the fire barely reaching her knees. "I am sorry for the hardship, truly, but a CEO cannot manage a global corporation based on emotion. I'm not asking for your sympathy, Daniel said, standing up and dusting off his jeans. I'm just stating a fact. Money buys a lot of things, Miss Carter, but it doesn't change the reality of what happens when you turn off the lights in a place like this. He walked over to an old wooden locker in the corner, prying it open with a muffled grunt. Inside were a couple of coarse, faded wool blankets left behind by forest rangers. He shook them out, checking for dampness, and walked back over to her. He handed her the thickest one. Put this over your shoulders, he said. Elena hesitated, her pride pushing back, but a violent shudder racked her body, forcing her to accept the blanket. It was rough and smelled faintly of pine and age, but as she wrapped it around herself, she felt the first true barrier against the freezing air. Thank you, she managed to say, her teeth clicking together. Daniel sat down on a low wooden bench opposite the fire, pulling his own arms into his chest. He looked tired, but his posture remained solid, an unbreakable anchor in the center of the dark cabin. Elena huddled closer to the flames, staring at him through the smoke. She was used to men who flattered her, men who tried to impress her, or men who feared her. Daniel did none of those things. He treated her like an equal, or perhaps, right now, like someone who desperately needed his protection. You mentioned a daughter, Elena said, trying to fill the oppressive quiet as the wind screamed outside, rattling the loose corrugated roof above them. What's her name? Lily, Daniel said. A subtle, profound softness instantly transformed his expression, erasing the hard lines around his eyes. She's 6. She thinks I'm just out picking up a shift at an all-night garage. Who is with her? Mrs. Gable. She lives downstairs from us. She's 80, but she's tough. She won't let Lily stay up past her bedtime, though Lily will absolutely try to convince her otherwise. Daniel let out a short, quiet chuckle, his eyes fixed on the dancing flames. She has this habit of hiding her shoes when she doesn't want to go to sleep, claiming the shoe monster took them. Elena felt a strange, unfamiliar ache in her chest. She had never wanted children. Her life was entirely consumed by the demanding, high-stakes universe of Carter dynamics. Her own childhood had been a succession of elite boarding schools and cold, transactional expectations from her father. Listening to this man speak about his daughter with such effortless, unconditional warmth made her feel incredibly hollow. She must miss you. Elena murmured. I miss her every second I'm away, Daniel replied simply. Before Elena could respond, a tremendous crash echoed from the roof. The wind had torn away, a piece of the outer flashing, and a sudden, violent draft of sub-zero air swept through the gaps in the cabin door. The fragile fire flared violently, then shrank down to a pathetic bed of glowing red coals. The temperature in the room plummeted instantly. Elena gasped as the cold hit her like ice water. She began to shake uncontrollably, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. She tried to pull the blanket tighter, but her fingers were too stiff to grip the fabric. The true severity of the mountain winter was breaking through their meager defense, and her corporate power meant absolutely nothing against it. Daniel moved instantly. He knelt beside her, his hand grasping her shoulder. Elena, he said, using her name for the first time, his voice commanding and steady. Look at me. She looked up, her vision slightly blurred by the sudden intensity of the chill. Her lips were turning a faint tint of blue. The fire isn't going to hold the room, Daniel said, his eyes drilling into hers with absolute focus. We have a serious problem. Your core temperature is dropping too fast, Daniel said, his voice dropping into a low, commanding register that left no room for argument. He reached down and firmly grasped her hands. They were stiff, the skin dangerously pale, and her fingers had lost all flexibility. The shivering is your body's natural defense trying to generate friction heat, but you are rapidly exhausting your glucose levels. If you stop shivering before we manage to secure a sustainable heat source, you are going to slip into severe, clinical hypothermia. Elena tried to pull her hands back from his grip, but her muscles simply refused to cooperate. Her jaw locked up, making her words sound forced and fragmented. I can handle it, she stammered, her chest heaving as she fought for control. Just focus on fixing the fire. Do your job. There is no more dry firewood within walking distance, and the northern draft is overriding the hearth, Daniel replied, entirely unbothered by her desperate attempt to assert authority. He rose to his feet in one fluid motion, grabbed his heavy tactical canvas backpack, and marched toward the door. He jammed the rugged pack hard into the structural gap where the exterior metal flashing had torn away, instantly cutting off the whistling slipstream of freezing air. He moved with an efficient, calculated precision that belonged to a trained survivalist or a tactical operator, not a standard factory assembly mechanic. He returned to her side, unzipping the secondary compartment of his utility bag to search for any remaining insulation supplies. As he pulled out a tightly compressed, military-grade emergency thermal liner, a heavy object slipped from the pocket and tumbled onto the dusty wooden floorboards. It was a scratch-resistant, matte black titanium watch. It featured an intricate triple bezel display, specialized tactical subdials, and a reinforced strap. As it caught the fading crimson glint of the dying embers, a distinct emblem engraved on the casing was revealed. A striking falcon clutching a lightning bolt, positioned directly beneath the words Ghost Squadron. Elena's eyes, though heavy with exhaustion, locked onto the timepiece. Carter Dynamics was one of the primary defense aerospace contractors for the United States military. She had sat through countless high-security Pentagon briefings and reviewed classified production contracts. She knew exactly what that emblem represented. Ghost Squadron did not exist on any public military registry. It was the legendary, ultra-classified experimental stealth testing unit composed entirely of the nation's top decorated fighter pilots and elite aerospace engineers. Those specific chronographs were custom manufactured by a private Swiss luxury house, issued exclusively to the commanders of that elite division. "Where did you get that?" Elena whispered, her voice cracking as she stared from the luxury tactical watch to Daniel's calm, unreadable face. "That is an extremely restricted military issue. Only a handful of elite aviators in the entire country possess that specific model." Daniel picked up the watch without a single trace of panic, sliding it casually back into his pocket. "I buy miscellaneous gear at government surplus auctions sometimes," he said smoothly, his tone completely level. "Right now, we need to focus on what actually matters." He unrolled the specialized thermal liner, spreading it over the rough wool blankets. Without asking for permission, he sat down directly beside her on the wooden floor, pulling her shivering frame back against his broad chest and wrapping the dense layers tightly around both of them to trap their collective energy. Elena stiffened automatically, her corporate defense mechanisms screaming against the sudden, absolute proximity. She had spent the last decade enforcing strict physical and emotional boundaries, ensuring that no one ever got close enough to see her doubts or her vulnerabilities. But as Daniel's massive, steady warmth enveloped her, the sheer terror of the mountain storm began to recede. He did not hold her with any hesitation or awkwardness. His embrace was purely protective, solid as granite, a wall of quiet, masculine security shielding her from the absolute chaos outside. "Stay awake, Elena," Daniel murmured near her ear, his breath warm against her freezing cheek. "Talk to me. Tell me something. Anything. If you fall asleep right now, your heart rate will drop too much, and it will be much harder to pull you back." Elena swallowed hard, her heart hammering against her ribs, no longer from the terror of the blizzard, but from the overwhelming intensity of this man's grounded presence. "I don't know what to say," she admitted, her voice incredibly small and fragile. "My mind is completely blank. I am used to talking about corporate acquisitions, not this." "Then I will talk," Daniel said softly, his voice wrapping around her like a secondary shield. "I will tell you about Lily. When she was 3 years old, she caught a severe respiratory virus during a massive autumn storm. The local clinic in our town was closed for the weekend, and the alternator on my old truck had completely died that morning. I didn't have the money for a taxi, let alone an expensive emergency room ambulance." Elena listened intently, her cheek pressed against the rough canvas fabric of his collar, listening to the deep, rhythmic, comforting beat of his heart. "I wrapped her in 3 thick layers of blankets, tucked her against my chest just like I am holding you right now, and walked 4 miles through a torrential rainstorm to reach the county hospital," Daniel continued, his tone carrying a profound emotional weight. "She was crying the entire way, absolutely terrified of the thunder. I just kept singing this ridiculous little song she liked about a yellow bird. By the time we finally reached the emergency room, my work boots were soaked through with blood from raw blisters, and I was entirely exhausted. But the exact moment the doctor took her into the examination room and told me she was going to be completely fine, I didn't feel a single ounce of pain. That is what being a parent actually means. You don't care what happens to your own body, as long as the person relying on you is safe." Elena felt a single warm tear slip from her eye, tracing down her cheek before disappearing into the blanket. She had never experienced that kind of unconditional protection in her entire life, Her own father had measured her personal worth purely by her academic grade averages and her ability to execute corporate takeovers. If she showed weakness, she was ignored. "You love her so much," Elena whispered, her muscles finally beginning to relax completely against his immense, unyielding warmth. "She is my entire world," Daniel said quietly. The storm continued to batter the exterior of the forestry cabin, throwing massive sheets of jagged ice against the log walls. But inside the dark, confined space, the freezing air was slowly losing its grip. Elena closed her eyes, entirely anchored by the steady rise and fall of the chest of the man whose life she had disrupted. She did not know that miles away, back at her sprawling estate in the valley, her young nephew Lucas, whom she had legally adopted after her sister's passing, was currently sobbing in his bedroom. Terrified of the roaring thunder, while her highly paid household staff tried desperately and unsuccessfully to comfort him, she did not realize how deeply these two entirely separate universes were about to collide. Suddenly, a sharp, metallic snap echoed from the front of the cabin. The heavy wooden bar holding the main window shutter cracked under the immense pressure of a massive wind gust, swinging wide open with a deafening bang. A fresh cascade of heavy snow and sub-zero air blasted directly into the room, threatening to destroy their fragile sanctuary. Before the freezing air could completely erase the fragile pocket of warmth they had built, Daniel was already moving. He left the shelter of the thermal blankets, his large frame silhouetted against the roaring white void of the open window. Elena gasped as the sudden drop in temperature hit her lungs like liquid nitrogen. She watched through the gloom, her body trembling violently, as Daniel braced his boots against the decaying log wall. The wooden shutter was slamming violently against the exterior of the cabin, driven by 60-mile-per-hour gusts. With a low grunt of pure physical exertion, Daniel reached out into the blinding storm, grabbed the whipping edge of the heavy timber, and pulled it back by sheer force. The muscles in his back strained against his canvas jacket. Finding a length of high-tensile steel wire in his utility pack, he looped it 3 times around the rusted iron rings of the frame, securing the shutter with a series of tight, unbreakable knots. He slammed the inner latch home, instantly plunging the room back into a heavy, shielded silence. When he walked back to the hearth, his face was dusted with ice, his eyelashes frozen white, but his breathing remained perfectly steady. He sat back down beside her, pulling the thermal liner over them once more, effortlessly offering his immense warmth without a single word of complaint. Elena looked at his calm, unbothered expression, a profound realization settling deep into her chest. She possessed billions of dollars, a global empire, and absolute authority over thousands of lives. Yet she had never known a single moment of true peace. This man, who had absolutely nothing left to his name, provided absolute safety without even trying. The dawn broke in a muted, silent gray. The furious howling of the blizzard had finally died down to a whisper, replaced by a deep, rhythmic thudding that vibrated through the wooden floorboards. Daniel opened his eyes first. "Helicopter," he said quietly. They stepped out into the blinding brightness of the fresh snow. Hovering just 50 yards away was a massive, pristine white corporate helicopter emblazoned with the navy and gold insignia of Carter Dynamics. As it touched down on a cleared ridge, a team of private, heavily armed security personnel in tailored black winter gear deployed from the cabin, accompanied by 2 flight medics. The moment the boots of her rescue team hit the snow, a visible transformation came over Elena. The vulnerable, shivering woman who had wept against Daniel's chest vanished. Her spine straightened, her jaw set into a rigid, impenetrable line, and her eyes flashed with the cold, calculating intelligence that made her feared in every boardroom across the country. She stepped forward, effortlessly reclaiming her crown as the billionaire executive. "Ma'am, thank God," the lead security officer said, rushing forward to drape a pristine, heated-down coat over her shoulders. "The board has been in emergency session since your tracker went offline. Your private transport is prepped at Vanguard Executive Airfield." Elena nodded sharply, her voice clipped and professional. "Assess the vehicle down the ridge later. Let's move." She began walking toward the vibrating aircraft, her designer boots sinking into the crisp snow. Then she paused, looking back over her shoulder at Daniel, who stood quietly by the cabin door, his hands tucked into his pockets, entirely unbothered by the sudden influx of wealth and power around him. "Daniel, come with us. We will drop you at the airfield hangar. It's only 10 miles from your town." Daniel didn't argue. He walked with a slow, grounded pace, boarding the luxurious, leather-lined interior of the helicopter. During the 10-minute flight, Elena sat across from him, entirely absorbed in a high-encryption satellite tablet handed to her by her assistant. She was issuing rapid-fire directives, her voice cold and completely controlled as she managed a multi-million-dollar supply chain crisis caused by the storm. She didn't look at Daniel once. The corporate wall was fully back up, creating an agonizing, silent chasm between them. The helicopter descended into the massive, climate-controlled expanse of Hangar 4 at Vanguard Executive Airfield. The polished white epoxy floors reflected the gleaming hulls of several private corporate jets. A small crowd of senior executives, legal advisors, and administrative staff stood waiting in a precise formation. As the heavy sliding doors of the helicopter opened, Julian Vance, the Senior Vice President of Operations for Carter Dynamics, stepped forward. Julian was a man defined by a sharp, expensive haircut, a bespoke three-piece suit, and an absolute disdain for anyone he deemed beneath his social standing. "Elena, an absolute nightmare," Julian said, offering her a hand as she stepped down. "The press has been circling like vultures. We've already drafted the press release regarding your miraculous survival." Julian's eyes then drifted past Elena, landing directly on Daniel, who was stepping out behind her in his grease-stained jeans and faded, mud-flecked canvas jacket. Julian's expression instantly twisted into a look of profound disgust. "What is this?" Julian sneered, his voice echoing loudly across the quiet hangar, drawing the immediate attention of dozens of nearby mechanics and assistants. "Elena, don't tell me some opportunistic local drifter managed to attach himself to your rescue. Security, remove this man from the premium perimeter immediately. Check his pockets to ensure he didn't lift anything from the aircraft." Before Elena could open her mouth to intervene, a high-pitched, agonizing scream shattered the corporate quiet of the hangar. From the glass-walled VIP waiting lounge at the edge of the hangar, a 7-year-old boy broke past two frantic private nannies. It was Lucas, Elena's orphaned nephew. The boy was hyperventilating, his eyes wide with absolute blind terror, his hands clamped tightly over his ears. The high-pitched whine of the starting jet engines across the tarmac, combined with the chaotic crowd and the residual trauma of the storm, had triggered a massive, uncontrollable sensory meltdown. Elena immediately rushed toward him, her poised executive exterior completely fracturing. "Lucas! Lucas! Stop this right now!" she pleaded, her voice rising in a panicked, rigid command as she reached out to grab his shoulders. "Look at me! I am right here! The storm is over! Stand up and behave yourself! Look at me!" But her sharp, high-stress tone only amplified the boy's terror. Lucas kicked violently, screaming louder, his face turning an alarmed shade of crimson as he curled into a tight ball on the hard epoxy floor, utterly unreachable. Elena stood over him, her hands trembling violently, looking around at her executives with absolute, terrified helplessness. Her billions could buy aerospace conglomerates, but they could not buy a single ounce of emotional security for her suffering child. Julian Vance glared at Daniel, who was watching the child with intense, focused eyes. "I thought I told you to get out." Julian barked at Daniel, gesturing wildly to 3 burly hangar guards. "Drag this trash out into the snow before he ruins the family image any further." 2 guards stepped forward, their heavy hands clamping onto Daniel's shoulders, but Daniel didn't flinch. His eyes remained locked on the weeping boy, and a dangerous, quiet authority suddenly radiated from his frame. The guard's hands were heavy on Daniel's shoulders, but with a sudden, microscopic shift in his posture, he twisted his torso. It wasn't a violent strike, but a flawless demonstration of kinetic leverage. The 2 large security guards stumbled back, their grips completely broken, their faces flashing with stunned confusion. "Touch me again, and we'll have a completely different conversation," Daniel said, his voice dropping into a low, terrifyingly calm register. He didn't even look at the guards. His eyes were entirely focused on the sobbing child on the floor. Julian Vance gasped, his face flushing with rage. "Are you insane? Secure him. He's a threat." "Julian! Shut up!" Elena screamed, her polished composure entirely shattered. She was on her knees next to Lucas, her hands hovering over him, trembling violently. Lucas was shaking so hard his heels were drumming against the white epoxy floor, his breath coming in dangerous, shallow gasps. He was slipping into a full hyperventilation cycle. "Lucas, please! You're making a scene! Look at me!" Daniel ignored the executives, the guards, and the crowd of onlookers. He walked forward with slow, deliberate steps and sat directly down on the hard, cold hangar floor right next to the panicked boy. He didn't grab the child. He didn't raise his voice. He simply leaned back against a heavy baggage cart, took a deep, loud, rhythmic breath, and began to speak in a low, resonant, unbothered tone. "The wind speed inside this building is 0, Lucas," Daniel said softly, his voice cutting through the chaotic echoes of the hangar like a heavy anchor. "The ceiling is 40 feet high. The structural steel is rated for high-impact forces. You are inside a fortress." Lucas froze for a fraction of a second, his screaming dropping to a jagged whimper. The boy's tear-filled eyes darted toward the man sitting calmly on the floor beside him. "My daughter Lily hates the sound of jet engines too," Daniel continued, keeping his breathing slow, steady, and incredibly loud so the boy could track the rhythm. "She thinks they sound like angry monsters. But I told her a secret. It's just air trapped in a tube, throwing a temper tantrum because it wants to go fast. It can't hurt you when you're inside the hangar. The hangar is the safety zone." Elena watched in absolute, breathless silence. Her mouth was slightly open, her chest heaving. She had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on the finest child psychologists and private specialists in the country, yet none of them had ever been able to break through one of Lucas's severe meltdowns. They always tried to reason with him, or negotiate, or command him. Daniel was doing none of that. He was simply offering a massive, immovable wall of emotional security. Slowly, hesitantly, Lucas unclasped his hands from his ears. He looked at Daniel's faded canvas jacket, then up at his calm, steady face. Without a word, the boy crawled across the remaining few inches of the floor and buried his face directly into Daniel's chest, his small hands gripping the rough fabric tightly. Daniel wrapped a large, protective arm around the boy, pulling him close, his chest rising and falling in a slow, comforting rhythm. Within 2 minutes, the boy's hyperventilation ceased entirely, replaced by quiet, rhythmic breathing. Elena let out a shaky breath, her hands still trembling as she looked at Daniel. The stark contrast between her immense wealth and this man's effortless emotional strength hit her with the force of a physical blow. She had everything money could buy, yet she could not give her nephew peace. This man gave safety without even trying. "Get up from there this instant, Elena," Julian Vance snapped, though he kept his distance from Daniel now. "This is highly inappropriate. The photographers from the Business Journal are arriving at the main terminal in 5 minutes. We cannot have the CEO rolling on the floor with a terminated factory worker." Before Elena could fire back, a deafening, metallic shriek ripped through the hangar walls. Outside on the tarmac, a prototype twin-engine executive transport jet, the Apex Horizon, was undergoing a routine pre-flight system check. Suddenly, a massive plume of thick, oily black smoke erupted from the right engine cowling. The high-pitched whine of the turbine transformed into an alarming, jagged, rattling sound that shook the glass windows of the VIP lounge. "Compressor surge," one of the senior hangar mechanics yelled, dropping his clipboard as he backed away in terror. "The automated fuel cutoff valve is jammed open. It's undergoing a hot start stall." The ground crew began to scatter in panic. If the turbine blades sheared under the intense thermal pressure, they would turn into lethal pieces of shrapnel, tearing through the fuel lines and detonating the entire aircraft right outside the main hangar doors. The automated emergency klaxon began to blare a piercing, rhythmic alarm across the facility. High-output fire suppression doors began to slide shut automatically, threatening to trap everyone inside the hangar with a ticking bomb. Julian Vance screamed in terror, sprinting toward the rear emergency exit, completely abandoning Elena and the child. The entire hangar erupted into blind chaos as staff panicked and fled. Daniel didn't panic. He gently detached Lucas, handing the calm boy directly into Elena's arms. He stood up to his full height, his eyes instantly scanning the mechanical layout of the burning engine through the open hangar doors. He turned toward the chief hangar engineer, who was frantically pressing useless buttons on a frozen digital control console. The digital avionics bus is locked in a feedback loop. Daniel shouted over the roar of the failing engine, his voice vibrating with absolute, high-level technical authority. "Manual override won't work from the terminal. You need to cut the primary battery bus behind the nose gear." The chief engineer blinked in total shock, staring at Daniel. "How do you know the avionics layout of an unreleased military-grade prototype?" Daniel didn't answer. He was already sprinting directly toward the roaring, smoke-shrouded aircraft. The thick, oily smoke billowed across the concrete tarmac, obscuring the blinding morning sun. The Apex Horizon jet was shuddering violently on its landing gear, the high-pitched metallic shriek of the failing turbine escalating into a deafening roar. Bits of glowing white-hot debris began to spark from the rear exhaust cone. A catastrophic engine explosion was seconds away. Daniel sprinted straight into the hazardous haze, his face expressionless, his eyes locked entirely on the underbelly of the multi-million-dollar aircraft. Behind him, inside the relative safety of Hangar 4, Elena held Lucas tightly against her chest. Her breath hitched as she watched Daniel's tall silhouette disappear completely into the rolling black clouds. The sheer madness of what he was doing terrified her, yet she couldn't tear her eyes away. Daniel reached the nose gear assembly. The heat radiating from the right-wing root was already intense enough to blister paint, but he didn't falter. He slid beneath the low fuselage, his boots tracking through spilled hydraulic fluid. He knew this airframe. He knew it better than any mechanic on the tarmac, better than the engineers who had stamped the blueprint. He reached up, bypassing the standard maintenance panels, and pressed his palm against a smooth, seamless section of the reinforced titanium hull. He pressed a hidden micro-switch concealed beneath an intake rivet. A small, unmapped access door clicked open, revealing a heavily shielded dark glass interface, a classified emergency avionics bus designed exclusively for military field testing failures. The digital screen flashed red. Critical error. System lockout. Authentication required. The chief hangar engineer, who had reluctantly followed Daniel out to the edge of the smoke, screamed over the roar of the engine. "It's useless. That's an encrypted military-grade security firewall. Without the manufacturer's terminal master key, the fuel valves will remain jammed open until the core detonates." Daniel didn't look back. His calloused fingers moved across the numeric glass interface with blinding speed, typing in an alphanumeric encryption bypass sequence that defied standard logic. He didn't hesitate for a single microsecond. The screen instantly flipped from flashing crimson to a cool, solid amber. Command override accepted. Cold crank commencing. Daniel reached inside the panel, grabbed a heavy, insulated copper master link lever, and threw his weight against it. With a violent metallic snap, the primary battery bus was severed. The constant electrical pulse feeding the jammed fuel pump vanished. The deafening, high-pitched screech of the turbine immediately began to decelerate, dying down into a low, wheezing whistle before spinning to a complete, silent halt. The thick black smoke rapidly thinned, dispersing into the cold mountain air. A heavy, absolute silence fell over the entire airfield tarmac. The ground crew stood frozen, their mouths wide open, staring at the smoking jet, and then at the man in the grease-stained canvas jacket who was calmly wiping a smear of black soot from his forehead. The chief engineer slowly dropped his wrench, his eyes wide with a mixture of profound shock and utter disbelief. "That sequence is classified at the highest federal level," the engineer whispered, his voice trembling as the rest of the mechanics crept closer. "Only the chief project architect of the entire propulsion system possesses that override sequence." "Who the hell are you?" Before Daniel could answer, Julian Vance came marching out from the rear emergency exit, having realized the danger of an immediate explosion had passed. His expensive leather shoes clicked loudly on the damp tarmac. His chest puffed out as he tried to reclaim control of the narrative in front of the gathered staff. "It doesn't matter who he is," Julian shouted, gesturing furiously to the airfield security officers who were tentatively returning to their posts. "He just tampered with a proprietary, highly classified defense prototype. He could have compromised our entire corporate aerospace division. Arrest this man immediately and hold him in the lower security office until our corporate legal counsel arrives." The security guards hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. They had just watched Daniel effortlessly save the entire facility from a devastating explosion, while Julian ran away like a coward. "Did you hear me?" Julian barked, his face twisting into an ugly, venomous sneer as he stepped right up to Daniel. "You are a terminated assembly line laborer. You are nothing. You have no right to touch this equipment. I will personally ensure you spend the next 10 years in a federal penitentiary for industrial espionage." "Julian, stand down!" Elena's voice rang out across the tarmac, sharp and commanding. She walked toward them, her posture rigid, her eyes burning with an intense, protective anger. She had handed Lucas to a trusted executive assistant, and now she stood directly between Julian and Daniel. This man just saved your life, and he saved this entire airfield. You will show him respect. Respect for a thief? Julian laughed bitterly, turning to the crowd. Elena, look at him. He's a nobody. He probably looked up some outdated manual on the dark web. At that exact moment, the loud, rhythmic thudding of heavy military rotor blades echoed from the southern sky. A massive, sleek, black tactical transport helicopter bearing no visible registration numbers dropped rapidly from the clouds, landing directly on the primary runway just 50 yards from the hangar. The side doors slid open instantly. A contingent of 4 elite military police officers in full tactical gear deployed, forming a precise security corridor. Stepping out from the center of the unit was a decorated 4-star general, his chest covered in rows of prestigious service medals, his expression grim and unyielding. It was General Raymond Cross, the head of the Pentagon's Advanced Aerospace Warfare Command. Julian Vance's eyes went wide with opportunistic delight. He immediately smoothed his tie and hurried toward the general, his voice dripping with sycophantic praise. General Cross, sir, welcome to Vanguard Airfield. You arrived just in time. We have a serious security breach. This low-level drifter has compromised the Apex Horizon prototype. General Cross didn't even look at Julian. He brushed past the executive as if he were entirely invisible, walking with heavy, military precision straight toward Daniel. The general stopped exactly 2 feet in front of Daniel. He snapped his boots together, brought his right hand up to his brow, and delivered a flawless, deeply respectful military salute. Colonel Mercer, General Cross said, his booming voice echoing clearly across the silent, stunned tarmac. The Pentagon has been trying to locate your position for the last 48 hours. We have an emergency strategic crisis at the Capitol hangar, sir. We need the finest aviation mind this country has ever produced back in the command chair. The entire crowd gasped in unison. Julian Vance froze mid-sentence, his face turning an alarmed, sickly shade of white as his jaw dropped to his chest. Elena stared at Daniel, her heart hammering violently against her ribs as the pieces of the puzzle finally slammed together. The humble factory worker who had saved her life in the snow was a legendary military hero. The silence that blanketed Hangar 4 was heavy, almost suffocating. Julian Vance stood entirely paralyzed, his hands still awkwardly suspended in midair toward General Cross. The blood had drained so completely from his face that his skin resembled the white epoxy flooring beneath his feet. The senior executives behind him shifted uncomfortably, a wave of anxious whispers rippling through the corporate ranks. Elena Carter could hear the frantic beating of her own heart. She stared at Daniel. No, Colonel Mercer. The piece of titanium luxury gear, the unyielding calm in the face of a freezing death, the flawless understanding of a classified military prototype, it all slammed into place with undeniable, crushing clarity. This man was not a casualty of her corporate restructuring. He was a giant who had chosen to walk among the ordinary. Daniel slowly lowered his arm from his jacket pocket. He looked at General Cross, his expression remaining entirely unruffled, though his posture tightened into a stance of absolute command. At ease, Raymond, Daniel said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that instantly made the 4-star general nod and drop his hand. I told you 2 years ago when I took off the uniform, I am a full-time father now. My engineering days are behind me. With all due respect, Colonel, the new stealth propulsion matrix you designed for the Aegis program is experiencing a critical system failure at the Capitol testing grounds, General Cross replied, his tone urgent yet deeply deferential. The Pentagon drone fleet is grounded. The Joint Chiefs explicitly ordered me to find the only man who can rewrite the code. We didn't know you were in the valley until your emergency transponder watch pinged from the Blackwood Pass cabin early this morning. Julian Vance swallowed hard, his knees visibly trembling as he took a tentative, terrified step forward. General Cross, he stammered, his voice reduced to a pathetic high-pitched squeak. There has been an egregious misunderstanding. We didn't realize this officer was affiliated with the defense program. I was simply trying to protect corporate property. General Cross turned his head slowly, his icy glare locking onto Julian like a laser-guided missile. You are Julian Vance? The general asked, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. The logistics executive who filed the security report? I've read your file, Mr. Vance. While Colonel Mercer was flying combat extraction missions over active war zones and designing the very foundations of American aerospace superiority, you were falsifying expense reports at a desk. If you ever speak to this officer with disrespect in my presence again, I will have the Department of Defense audit your entire corporate branch before sunset." Julian shrank back, his face twisting into an expression of utter humiliation. He looked around the hangar, but every single employee, mechanic, and guard was staring at him with open disgust. The absolute power he thought he held had vanished into thin air. Elena stepped forward, her eyes never leaving Daniel. The cold, impenetrable CEO exterior she had worn like a suit of armor for a decade felt entirely hollow now. She felt a deep, piercing wave of shame for how she had initially treated him. But beneath that shame was something far more profound, an intense, magnetic admiration that made her chest tighten. "Julian," Elena said, her voice cutting through the hangar with terrifying absolute finality, "you are stripped of your title, your stock options, and your access privileges. Effective immediately, you are terminated from Carter Dynamics. Security, escort him off the airfield property. If he touches so much as a single file, have him arrested." The very guards Julian had commanded moments ago stepped forward with grim satisfaction, grabbing Julian by the arms and dragging him toward the exit. Julian didn't say a word. He kept his head bowed, utterly broken by the sudden, brutal reversal of his fortune. Elena walked over to Daniel, stopping just inches from him. The crowd of executives and military personnel stepped back, granting them a small perimeter of privacy. She looked up at him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to hide the subtle tremble in her fingers. "You didn't tell me," she whispered, her voice stripped of all corporate authority, leaving only raw human vulnerability. "In the cabin, when you were freezing, when you gave me everything to keep me alive. You let me believe you were just a laid-off mechanic." "I was a laid-off mechanic, Elena," Daniel said softly, his dark eyes meeting hers with the same grounded, comforting warmth she had felt during the darkest hours of the storm. "When the Silver Creek plant closed, I was just a dad trying to figure out how to buy groceries for my daughter. The medals and the titles don't mean anything when you're looking at an empty refrigerator." Elena felt a profound ache in her throat. She looked at Lucas, who was now standing quietly by her assistant, watching Daniel with wide, trusting eyes. The boy was completely calm, entirely anchored by Daniel's presence. "I want to make it right," Elena said, her voice shaking slightly as she looked into Daniel's steady eyes. "Not just for the plant, for everything. I've spent my whole life believing that power was something you build with numbers and contracts, but you showed me what real strength looks like." A palpable, heavy tension hung between them, a magnetic awareness that had grown from the freezing depths of the mountain and survived the harsh glare of the real world. Elena found herself leaning slightly toward him, her breath catching as Daniel stepped a fraction closer, his large protective frame radiating the exact same safety that had kept her heart beating through the blizzard. "Colonel," General Cross interrupted gently, though his tone remained firm. "The transport is fueled. We need to move." Daniel nodded slowly, his eyes lingering on Elena's face for a long, silent moment. "I have to go handle this, Elena," he murmured. "But I have a daughter waiting for me at home, and I always keep my promises to her." "Let me take care of Lily," Elena said instantly, the offer slipping from her lips before she could even think to calculate the corporate optics. "I will personally go to your apartment. I will ensure she is safe, warm, and brought back to my estate with Lucas until you return. Please. Let me do this for you." Daniel studied her face, searching her eyes for the cold executive he had met on the mountain road, but she was gone. Standing before him was a woman who was finally choosing compassion over control. A soft, genuine smile touched Daniel's lips. "The spare key is under the blue flower pot on the porch," Daniel said quietly. "Tell her the yellow bird sent you." He turned and walked toward the military helicopter with strong, commanding strides. As the massive aircraft lifted into the sky, Elena stood on the tarmac, the wind from the rotors whipping her hair across her face, watching him go. She didn't feel cold anymore. She felt an overwhelming sense of purpose, entirely unaware that the final, most shocking truth of Daniel's legacy was still waiting to be uncovered at his humble apartment. The drive to the lower valley was a blur of shifting emotions for Elena. She parked her luxury sedan outside the modest, weathered apartment complex in the working-class district of Silver Creek. Walking up the creaking wooden stairs to the second floor, she felt a profound sense of humility. She found the blue flower pot on the porch, reached underneath, and slid the brass key into the lock. Inside, the apartment was small, immaculate, and filled with the unmistakable warmth of a real home. An elderly woman with kind, tired eyes rose from a rocking chair near the window. "You must be Elena, Mrs." Gable said, a knowing smile crinkling her face. "Daniel called from a secure military line. He told me to expect you." From behind the kitchen counter, a little girl with bright, inquisitive eyes and a wild nest of brown curls peeked out. She was holding a worn plush rabbit. "Are you the lady from the snow?" Lily asked, her voice soft but entirely devoid of fear. Elena knelt down on the rug, bringing herself to the child's eye level. For the first time in her life, she didn't care about wrinkling her designer trousers. "I am," Elena said gently, her voice thickening with emotion. "Your dad had to go help some people fly their planes safely. But he gave me a special message for you. He told me to tell you that the yellow bird sent me." Lily's face lit up with absolute radiant joy. She dropped her rabbit and ran straight into Elena's arms, burying her face into her shoulder. Elena held the little girl tightly, a tear finally escaping her eye and soaking into Lily's cotton shirt. Holding this child, she understood exactly why Daniel had been willing to endure everything, while Mrs. Gable helped Lily pack a small suitcase for the stay at the estate. Elena stood near Daniel's modest wooden desk. Her eyes caught a faded, leather-bound portfolio tucked behind a row of children's storybooks. Drawn by an unexplainable curiosity, she opened it. Her breath caught in her throat. Inside was an original, gold-sealed utility document from the United States Patent and Trademark Office. It was the master patent for the multi-atmospheric ion propulsion core, the exact foundational technology that powered every single aircraft Carter Dynamics manufactured. For the past decade, her corporation had paid $300 million annually to an anonymous blind trust called Lily's Garden just to lease the rights to this technology. The primary ownership line didn't list a person's name. It was registered entirely under the encrypted corporate trust, Lily's Garden. But as Elena's eyes drifted to the very bottom of the official document, her breath caught completely in her throat. In the secure signature block reserved exclusively for the chief aerospace architect, there was a sharp, handwritten signature accompanied by the custom stamped insignia of the Ghost Squadron. Colonel D. Mercer. Elena leaned against the desk, completely stunned. Her corporate accounting and legal teams had only ever seen a faceless trust on paper for a decade, completely blind to the military legend behind it. Daniel didn't just work for her company. He practically owned the intellectual lifeblood of her entire empire. He possessed a personal fortune that rivaled her own, yet he had chosen to live in a two-bedroom apartment and work a grueling shift on an assembly line. He had hidden his immense wealth and historical legacy from the world for one beautiful, selfless reason: to ensure his daughter grew up grounded, loved, and entirely shielded from the predatory, toxic world of corporate greed. 3 hours later, the quiet courtyard of the Carter estate was filled with the laughter of children. Lucas, who had spent years locked in a prison of anxiety, was sitting on the manicured lawn, eagerly showing Lily his favorite model spaceships. Lily was animatedly explaining how ladybugs build houses in the grass. Elena stood on the veranda, a soft, peaceful expression on her face as she watched her nephew laugh out loud for the first time in memory. The deep, rhythmic thudding of a military helicopter broke the afternoon quiet. The black aircraft touched down on the estate's private helipad. The doors opened, and Daniel stepped out, wearing a clean charcoal suit provided by the military command. General Cross walked beside him, talking animatedly, before shaking Daniel's hand with profound, lingering respect. Daniel walked across the lawn. The moment Lily saw him, she screamed with delight. "Daddy!" she yelled, sprinting across the grass. Daniel dropped to his knees, catching her in midair and swinging her around in a great circle, his deep laughter echoing through the trees. Lucas walked up shortly after, standing beside them with a bright, confident smile. Daniel reached out, gently placing a hand on Lucas's shoulder, anchoring the boy instantly. Elena walked down the veranda steps, meeting Daniel as he stepped onto the stone pathway. The rest of her corporate board members, who had gathered at the estate for an emergency briefing, stood in a respectful, silent line near the doors, watching the interaction with absolute awe. "The Pentagon crisis is completely resolved," Daniel said, his eyes locking onto hers with that familiar, unyielding calm. "The fleet is back in the air." "I know," Elena whispered, stepping closer until the space between them vanished entirely. "And I know about Lily's Garden, Daniel. I know you own the propulsion patents. You could have bought my entire company twice over." Why did you work in my factory? Daniel looked at his daughter, who was now chasing a butterfly with Lucas. Because after my wife passed, I realized that money can buy 1,000 engineers, but it can't buy a single afternoon with your child. I wanted to be just a dad, Elena. I wanted her to love me for who I am, not what I own. He looked back at Elena, his gaze softening with a deep magnetic intensity. But the storm changed things. It showed me that sometimes you have to step back into the world to protect the people who matter. Elena reached out, her fingers gently tangling with his large, calloused hand. He didn't pull away. His grip was warm, solid, and incredibly protective. The Silver Creek facility is reopening tomorrow morning, Elena said, her voice clear and resonant, carrying across the lawn so every executive could hear. But it's no longer a manufacturing plant. It is being converted into the Mercer Advanced Aerospace Research Hub, and I would be deeply honored if you would accept the role of chief partner and co-director of Carter Dynamics. Not for the numbers, Daniel, but to help me run this company with a heart. Daniel studied her face, seeing the profound, permanent transformation in her eyes. The cold, ruthless billionaire was gone, replaced by a woman who had finally found her true northern anchor. On one condition, Daniel said, a handsome, teasing smile playing on his lips. I don't work past 5 o'clock. I have a shoe monster to hunt at bedtime. Elena laughed, a bright, beautiful sound that filled the afternoon air. Deal, she whispered. As the sun began to dip below the mountain peaks, casting a warm, golden-crimson glow over the valley, Daniel and Elena stood side by side, their hands tightly intertwined. The children's laughter echoed across the lawn, a sweet melody of a new beginning. The fierce winter storm had tried to break them, but in the end, it had simply cleared away the ice, revealing a love, a justice, and a future that was completely unbreakable.